Hi everyone, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. If you'll notice that your mic is likely muted, and so if you need to share anything down, if you hover down at the bottom, there is a chat feature, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on that throughout the webinar. So just make sure that you can hear me, and hold tight for just a minute. Okay, all right. Well, it's 4:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Um, we are going to spend the next hour talking to you guys about evidence-based classroom management strategies. My name is Elaine Miller, and my background is in special education. Um, and for about 10 years now, I've been working in higher ed. So previously at the University of South Carolina in the school behavioral health team that's organizing this event, and now currently at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. So because we have a large group today, I'm not going to be able to do introductions with everyone, but would like to get a sense for who we have with us. So we're going to send a polling question out that's just going to ask you what your current role in education is, and then also what state you're from. So we'll go ahead and send that now. And then we'll give people just maybe 10 seconds or so to complete it and share the results with the group. Okay. Danielle, you want to share the results? Okay, awesome. Yay! So we've got, and I think everyone can see the results, but it looks like we have the majority special education teachers, which that's my background. So awesome. I'm with my people, and we also have regular education teachers, behavioral interventionists, support staff, administrators, 80% from South Carolina, as well as some attendees from North Carolina and Georgia. So thank you all for joining us. So, all right, a little bit, just a quick view of what I'm going to go through today. So we're going to spend just a few minutes kind of going through, I want to describe the characteristics and the outcomes of students with emotional and behavioral disorders. And then we're going to review some classroom management strategies that can prevent and address problem behaviors. So some of them will be that teachers can implement with their entire class, and then some would be done with individual students who need extra support. And then at the end, I'll share some resources with you guys on those interventions, and I'm going to reserve probably the last 10 minutes or so for question and answer. I think you should be able to see that there's a question and answer option at the bottom, kind of if you hover at the bottom of your screen. I'll do my best to look at that periodically through the presentation, but if I don't notice it or get to the question, we'll definitely have some time at the end. All right, so who are the kids that may need extra support for their behavior in the classroom? Just a disclaimer, I'm going to share some information specific to students who have been identified with an emotional disability under IDEA. And we'll talk about this, but there is likely a good number of students who are showing a lot of those same characteristics and experiencing the same outcomes, but aren't necessarily identified in the special education category. So it can, be thought of even more broadly. So students with emotional and behavioral disabilities often exhibit externalizing problems that we would typically think of. So they may be disruptive, they may talk back or be argumentative, making jokes at inappropriate times. They may be non-compliant, not following rules, could show signs of aggression, hyperactivity, impulsivity. They may act immature and exhibit poor coping skills, or and have a difficulty learning or functioning at grade level. So in addition to those symptoms that we would typically associate with behavior problems, some students also have internalizing symptoms. So they may present as overly fearful or anxious. They may be depressed, have low self-esteem, or withdraw socially. So thinking about outcomes of students with EBD, they are more characteristics, they are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to attend poor performing schools. Students who are male or of color are disproportionately identified as having emotional and behavioral disabilities. And we know that mental health concerns impact about 20% of students. However, currently there's only about 1% of students identified as having a disability for EBD in schools. So we know, and especially we have a large special ed presence here, so we all know that the criteria for having a disorder or a disability are different in the mental health and the education world, but there's definitely reason to believe that we may be under-identifying students in need. And so that could be because the federal definition of EBD is too narrow or perhaps a little unclear. So just wanted to point that out because, like I said earlier, it's likely that students in classrooms maybe aren't in special education, but are really showing some of those signs. And we would want to make sure that all teachers have the training that they need to address problem behaviors. So in thinking about the outcomes, before we get to the strategies, I think, reminding us why is important, is one of the most important things. So while in school, students with emotional and behavioral disorders are twice as likely to be suspended or expelled than any other disability category. This is particularly true for students of color. So, for example, 16% of students in grades 17 or in grades 7 through 12 are Black, yet 78% of Black students with emotional and behavioral disabilities receive an out-of-school suspension. When we look at Caucasian students, we can see that they're suspended at rates that align with their population size. So there's a lot of work to be done to reduce the disparities there, and that warrants a whole different webinar, but I think it's just important to be aware of for this context. Additionally, 48% of students with emotional and behavioral disabilities report being teased at school, and they're 3 times more likely to be arrested while they're still in school. Students with emotional and behavioral disabilities have the highest rate of dropout than any other disability category. So about 35% currently drop out. They have significant trouble maintaining full-time employment. And perhaps the most alarming, about 70% who drop out are arrested within 5 years. And so students with emotional and behavioral disabilities are literally the school to prison pipeline that we hear about. So I know that that's a big downer, but I think it's just really important to kind of remember what is at stake when we think through what strategies we can implement to disrupt this cycle. And it's really not just the success of students that's at stake. We also know that a high number of teachers who leave the profession cite that problem behaviors and being inadequately trained in classroom management is a big factor in their decision to leave education. So it looks like we have a question. Let me see. Yes, and so I didn't mention this before. So the question that I got was, can we get this presentation that is printed by some way? Would you allow us to? Yes, and so we could not figure out how to share it within Zoom, but we are going to email the presentation as well as a booklet of handouts on each one of the strategies that we go over. So you all will have this at the end of the webinar. Good question, thank you. Okay, and so in order to change behavior, we need to operate with the understanding that all behaviors are related to consequences in the environment that they occur in. Okay, so I know a lot of you guys have heard of antecedent, behavior, and consequences, right? I know special ed people have. So what that means is that the behaviors that we see in a classroom are absolutely a function of the teaching environment and the consequences that occur as a result of their behavior. So that is a fundamental principle of applied behavioral analysis, which is really foundational to special education and other successful interventions or frameworks like PBIS. So that is not to say of course, there are things outside of the classroom that are impacting students, but teachers can have control over their ability to increase the behaviors that they want to see from students by thoughtfully modifying the teaching environment and kind of what happens after a behavior occurs. All right, so a lot of the resources and strategies that I'm going to share today can be found on the website for the Center for Promoting Research to Practice. At the end, like I just said, I'm going to share this link as well as other links that you may want to visit. But I wanted to point this website out in particular. I'm not affiliated with them anyway, but I was involved with a project that helped developed some of these resources, and I think that they are fabulous. I implemented them with teachers across the state of South Carolina for a few years, and I think they're really user-friendly. And so just wanted you guys to be aware of that and give them proper accreditation. So check it out. I'll give you guys the website here at the end. Okay, so, and then just another statement. So today I'm just focusing on classroom management strategies. Of course, there are lots of things outside of the classroom that support students with emotional behavioral challenges. They're like, PBIS, multi-tiered frameworks, mental health treatment, curriculum that like social emotional learning. But class-wide strategies can provide a structure for the teaching environment that will reduce the likelihood that students are going to misbehave in the classroom. So most fundamentally, we have to have class-wide expectations for students. And so before you roll your eyes, because it sounds so basic, we really have to be, in order to be effective, we know that we need to set expectations in a particular way. So what you would want to do is establish your expectations for the classroom in a way that the expectations are stated in positive terms. Students with emotional or behavioral problems may not make the connection of, if we tell them what not to do, they truly may not be able to quickly make the connection between what we are asking them to do. So we want to focus on what they're expected to do. The expectations should be observable and measurable. They should be simply stated and age appropriate. And we really want to keep them to a minimum of 3 to 5. I think that's a big one that I see schools and teachers struggle with. And the more simple and short and sweet that we can keep it, the more likely students are going to be able to follow expectations. So in addition, we need to take a step further and make sure that we're developing a formal plan for providing feedback to students when they comply with those expectations, and also thinking through ahead of time how you would provide corrective feedback for misbehavior. So we have to explicitly teach expectations like a lesson, share examples of positive examples and maybe non-examples of what following a particular expectation would look like, and make sure that it's something that we're revisiting and giving students the opportunity to practice and receive feedback on following those expectations. We recommend that you post expectations somewhere that's easy for students to see, and that you're frequently referring back to those expectations. So, and I'll share a quick example. I think that this is funny, and I won't be able to hear you guys laugh, so hopefully you find it funny too. But I'll share a quick example of why some of those things are really important. So last year, my 9-year-old was telling me about the expectations, his school-wide expectations, and his school had come up with the acrostic rule, and each letter represented a different expectation that students were supposed to abide by. And so the last one was E, which stood for enthusiasm for growth. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. How would you, what would that look like? How would you know if you were, showing enthusiasm for growth? And so he kind of thought about it for a minute, and he looked perplexed, and he said, well, it's like when you're really excited because it's someone's birthday. And so, which cracked me up and just reminded me that, students, especially the younger ones, but they do not necessarily know, we spend a whole lot of time, hours, days, thinking of expectations and thinking through them. And if we're not explicitly teaching and telling them what it looks like to meet those expectations, they could be thinking something totally off. So tracking progress, as far as meeting expectations, it's also important that we track progress in order to be able to give students feedback on if they're meeting those expectations. We want to, you can do that in a variety of ways. This is a really easy example, but you could just develop a chart like this. And so if you have 5 class rules, maybe at the end of the day, you're checking whether or not that particular rule was followed throughout the day. And you may give, so across the week, students would have 25 opportunities to earn that check mark or whatever. And so it's important to set realistic goals. We want to make sure that, if you start implementing expectations and teaching them and students are currently at 50%, we would set an incremental goal for meeting those expectations. And then just a comment, because I've gotten it a lot, but this is not just for little kids. So I've worked with high school teachers to revamp their classroom expectations. And, it wasn't uncommon that people would say, well, high school students are too old and I feel like they should be doing this already, which I totally get. But I will have to say that we did see some big successes, even with the older students. And it's a practice that does not have to be done forever. It can be faded just like anything else, as far as, maybe how frequently you were reinforcing students. So, just like anything else, we just have to meet students where they are. And this is really Classroom Management 101 and something that we probably don't spend adequate time doing. So in the packet that I'm going to send you, there's a reference guide with examples of class-wide expectations. There's worksheets to help you develop those expectations. And there's even videos of positive and corrective feedback on the website that I showed you. So there's a lot out there if you are interested in kind of revisiting what you're currently doing. Establishing routines would be another strategy. So routines are a set of sequential behaviors that maximize the structure in the classroom. It helps students know what to anticipate throughout their day and minimizes time spent on transition between tasks. So it can also help students monitor their own behavior. The first step for establishing routines would be to determine what types of routines would be appropriate for your classroom. If you have multiple kind of transitions throughout the day and there's a need for multiple routines, we'd recommend that you only implement kind of one at a time, so prioritize them. A routine would be, again, similar to the expectations. You would probably want to keep it chunked to about 4 to 5 steps and making sure that you're stating what you want them to do. So you would create a lesson plan to actually teach the routines, explicitly teach them role play examples and not examples. Students love to act out the wrong ways to do things, and then just make sure that you're providing plenty of opportunities to practice and providing feedback, whether it's positive or corrective, to reinforce students as they're performing those routines. And then again, I've got a reference guide for routines that have examples of routines from Lehigh website, and we're going to share those with you. Okay. So my very favorite one is increasing teacher and student positive interactions. So research has shown that compared to students without behavior problems, students with behavior problems receive much higher rates of negative feedback. So it's actually currently about students with behavior problems receive about 4 negative pieces of feedback for every 1 piece of positive feedback, which is almost exactly the opposite of what is recommended. So we often need to purposefully plan how we're going to give feedback to students because, and I know this is shocking, but students with emotional or behavioral disabilities are not necessarily the easiest to be positive with. And so kind of thinking through and having a plan and being purposeful about the feedback that you're providing can make a huge difference. We know that the more positive interactions that are observed in a classroom, the better the classroom climate is. There are fewer problem behaviors and the grades are even higher. So it's really important. Some tips would be making positive feedback as specific as possible. So just saying, good job may not be as powerful for students that have emotional or behavioral disabilities. So we tend to think about positive feedback a little more narrowly than it really is. Positive feedback would include any behavior from you that lets a student know that their academic or social behavior is correct. And working with students on increasing positive interactions, and working with teachers to increase positive interactions, and doing observations and then providing ratios, teachers are often really surprised at the rates that they are providing positive feedback. It is not necessarily intuitive. When people are doing it's much easier to notice when someone's not doing the right thing than it is to notice when they are doing the right thing. So there are a whole lot of different strategies that teachers can use to remind themselves to provide that positive feedback. So I know I was taught as a pre-service special ed teacher that, a simple trick like taking paper clips, a certain number of paper clips, and putting them in one pocket, and then taking one out and moving it to the other pocket each time I gave positive feedback, with having the goal of moving all of the paper clips over to the other pocket by the end of the class or whatever, time frame that you determine. So in addition, we can provide corrective feedback. Corrective feedback ideally would be something done kind of quietly or privately with a neutral tone and neutral facial expression. So we're telling the student that their behavior is incorrect, but then we're following that with what behavior you expect. And as soon as you are seeing that behavior, you're giving some sort of positive reinforcement. Another strategy for reminding yourself to give feedback, some teachers will set a visual cue around the classroom. So they know when I kind of am scanning the classroom and I see that, I'm going to look around and find somebody doing something that they're supposed to be doing and providing that praise. There are some really helpful tips in the handouts that we're going to provide at the end of the session. And, from physically circulating the classroom to the visual scans, setting up cues, etc. Let's check this. Okay. Okay. So classes with students who have emotional or behavioral disabilities often have a pretty low class-wide engagement, which as well as high rates of disruption and downtime. So student engagement is linked to higher grades and fewer behavior referrals, which allows for more time to teach, more instructional time. One of the best ways to increase engagement in the classroom would be to provide lots of opportunities for students to respond. Because we know that when students know that something is going to require a response from them, or we're going to ask them something of them, they're more likely to pay attention. And so, you know, I think that's true for a lot of people. I know I pay more attention when I think I might be called on. And so developing or incorporating lots of opportunities to respond throughout our instruction is going to lead to increased engagement. So there are several different strategies that you could use for increasing opportunities to respond. Some of the best ones that I've seen include guided notes. Those are teacher-prepared handouts that kind of prepare an outline for a lecture or a lesson that have fill-in-the-blank sections that students complete during class. Response cards, so cards or signs or items that are held up simultaneously by students to display an answer or response. So those cards can be pre-printed, like each student could have a card that said A or B, or true or false, or they could be like a mini dry erase board or write on where the teacher could, for example, like give a definition of the word, and the students would write the word on the board, and then everyone holds up their board at the same time. So not only is that giving students tons of opportunities to respond, but it's also giving the teacher a good way to be frequently checking for understanding. Computer-assisted instruction. So that's something I'm seeing more and more and more. So smart boards are super prevalent, and I'm seeing lots of schools and districts use online computer programs or technology to augment instruction. And that has been shown to solicit pretty high levels of response, and gives teacher, again, good feedback regarding student understanding of the material. Of course, students love technology and tend to find it pretty motivating. But I would just say the caveat is that they're not all created equal, and would, you know, may require teachers to spend a little bit of time up front exploring which ones they really feel are going to be the most useful for their classroom. So also peer tutoring sessions. All students are paired with a partner, and, you know, each partner would be, or each person would be assigned to be a tutor or a tutee, or a teacher and a student. And the roles are switched kind of halfway through a lesson, and the tutors become the students. So there, I'm gonna, again, you'll get some examples of those strategies in the handout that we're gonna provide. Okay, so now I'm gonna shift gears and talk about some individual interventions that teachers can do in the classroom. With, you know, individual students that maybe need some extra support for their behavior. So the first one I'm going to talk a little bit about is de-escalation. So de-escalation just provides, it identifies the stages of a behavior. So we know that behaviors go through a cycle, or acting out goes through a cycle, and provides a structure for us to think through how we can reduce those negative interactions. So just a little bit about the acting out cycle, and I've got some cool graphs kind of showing different teacher and student behaviors throughout the cycle, and the handouts that we're going to provide. So the first behavior in the cycle is where students are calm, they're cooperating, following directions. Teachers are reinforcing students for, the correct behaviors. Something may trigger the student. That could be an event, some sort of conflict. It could be in the classroom, not necessarily in the classroom. It could be triggered by an academic pressure or even from a correction from the teacher. And at that point, a teacher could consider trying to, being aware of that trigger for that student and maybe taking them aside, problem solving, or even just trying to distract them with some sort of activity that was engaging for that student. As the acting out cycle gets more intense, students may become agitated. They could be distracted. They may start tapping their hands or feet. They would become, disengaged with the instruction. They could make some health complaints. And at that time, a teacher, again, would try to, the teacher would remain calm, offer a choice in activity. Often, providing a choice for a student can be helpful. Consider giving a student a break or suggesting some sort of relaxation activity. So, hey, I can see that you might be getting a little upset. Do you want to take a break or step outside and take some deep breaths or whatever, you kind of have worked out with that student. If that doesn't work, their behavior will tend to accelerate. The student may start ignoring the teacher completely, arguing. You may start to see some verbal abuse, ripping or throwing objects. Ideally, the teacher remains calm, respectful, detached, provides a short, clear direction, and if it's not followed, they would follow that up with restating the direction or the expectation. If it's not followed again, the teacher should disengage. A lot of times, and that's really difficult, everyone has the tendency to kind of engage with students, go back and forth, and what the literature calls like escalating prompts. And what we see is that a student will escalate, and then the teacher escalates, and it just nothing good comes out of it. Once a teacher disengages, if a student does follow that, not command or direction from the teacher, the teacher would praise the student if they complied. If they continue to escalate, this is about the time that a student's behavior would peak. This is when the behavior would be the most intense, and the student could completely shut down. They could start crying. Teachers' number one obvious charge is to maintain the safety of other students, and may need to clear the room, call a counselor, mental health professional, school safety officer, whatever the school procedure is. Typically after a student peaks, and this is just really for any type of acting out behavior, eventually the student will just start to de-escalate. They may start to respond to concrete instructions. Typically this is when they start to deny behaviors or justify the behavior, blame others for their behavior. And the teacher should just allow the student to calm down, complete any necessary school paperwork. And then as a student, then they will kind of enter a recovery mode. They may start re-engaging, maybe just in independent activities. The teacher it may be an appropriate time for the teacher to prompt a student to restore the environment if they made a mess or something like that. And then it's recommended that during this recovery time, they were using a high rate of reinforcement. So teachers can create a lesson plan on the acting out cycle. This can be done with the entire class if it's warranted, or it can be done with an individualized student. There's several pages in the handouts that I'm going to give you that go through example lesson plans and example, so things that you could actually teach a student, but then also sort of worksheets where you could start identifying, so not exactly like a functional behavioral assessment, but start identifying, okay, this is what it looks like when the student is triggered, or these kind of things trigger a student. And these are, you know, kind of the things that the behaviors I'm going to do when I start seeing these signs in the student in order to prevent or shorten or just lessen the intensity of aggressive or acting out behavior. So another thing that we can do, you know, and really I think it should be done class-wide, but depending on where you're at and what's been done previously with students, students with emotional and behavioral disabilities often find that organization is a major challenge, of course, particularly with students that have attention deficit. Organization and difficulty keeping track of necessary materials are common problems for students and tends to lead to lost assignment, missing homework grades, zeros, disciplinary referrals, and negative interactions about schoolwork. So in teaching organizational skills, the teacher would focus on how to sort and store paperwork and how to track homework or other assignments. So some strategies that they could use is the adoption of an organizational checklist, which I like a whole lot, and we have an example in the handout, but it would be a chart that a student could complete daily, answering a few questions such as, are your binders free of loose papers? Or do you have your planner today in your book bag? This type of checklist really lends itself to providing a daily score. So if I have 5 things that I'm checking at the end of the day, if 3 of them were done, I get a 60% score for that day. And so it's really easy to come up with a measurable goal for improvement. That process could be facilitated by the teacher, spending a few minutes with the student, but really ultimately it's an awesome tool because students can self-monitor and start doing those more independently. Another strategy would be to employ a daily planner. I know some schools do this already, but for those that don't, just adopting and explicitly teaching students to have a designated place to record assignments and important due dates. So we've also used a missing assignment tracker, which is a really simple tool, but students like, and where they kind of take a sheet or to their different teachers, and any assignments that are missing, that could be tracked, which just provides a structure and a framework and helps develop some time management skills too. So if they know they were absent last week, it's particularly helpful for students where chronic absenteeism is a problem for various reasons, and we know that that's somewhat common for students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. So those can be used for those students in particular. So if they were absent, you know, and they've got these assignments to turn in, they can ask their teacher, okay, what exactly are the assignments that I missed? And what's the last date that I can turn them in? And kind of work through it systematically. So there are sample forms of all of those in the packet of an example of an organizational checklist, as well as a daily planner that just can be printed from your printer. and the missing assignment tracking sheets. All right, and so then I think the last thing, or one of the last things, is just study skills. So students with emotional or behavioral disabilities often struggle academically. It's something we often talk about. So are they misbehaving because of their academic deficits, or are their academic deficits creating some problem behaviors? They're both very interrelated. But so it's really common for students to act out if they're feeling unprepared for academic demands. And improving a student's study skills and competence can really promote student success on tests or quizzes, and can in turn enhance school engagement or feelings of academic self-esteem. So there are a few good ways to do that. There's probably a lot more, but some of the ones that we've used, basic flashcards with everybody's, aware of. One thing that we recommend is just teaching students the process of developing the flashcard, but then also shuffling them, and then as they're going through them, dividing them into two piles. So known and unknown, and trying to go through at least 20 flashcards in a minute or less, so that they can get fluent with the terms. Strategic studying. So sometimes students need to be explicitly taught, how do I study for that test? And we know that these strategies can improve test scores, as well as retention and recall. It can also help ease test anxiety. And so I'm going to be giving you guys some examples of common strategies, such as acrostics or using initial letter strategies. I've seen silly stories strategies, or the imagery method, as well as test taking strategies. So, things as simple as circling and coming back to a question that you can't answer quickly. All right, so I want to point you to several different resources here. So this is the Center for Promoting Research to Practice. This is out of Lehigh, and they're the ones, so like I said, I'm going to be sharing all of the reference guide and examples for those interventions that I shared today, but they can also be accessed and downloaded from this URL. I also highly recommend the pbis.org. They have many webinars. I was looking through it today just to point some out, but there are some really awesome recorded webinars, as well as materials that you can download on classroom management. So I highly recommend you checking those out. Same goes for the Council for Exceptional Children, specifically the Council for Children with Behavioral Disabilities. They have a whole teacher resources section with, similar to the PBIS, lots of things that you can download, example behavior plans, all kinds of forms that you can go through and adapt for your classroom or your student. If you're interested in finding, if you've tried all of these strategies and you feel like you need something more, like I mentioned earlier, there's lots of evidence-based social emotional learning curriculum that can be implemented. The What Works Clearinghouse, which is it's a very hard to get into repository, very thoroughly researched repository of evidence-based practices for various issues you may have. So check that out, and you can look into curriculum, some free, some for profit, that could be implemented in your school or in your classroom. The American Psychological Association has a classroom management page as well with some resources. So especially some of our guidance counselors or mental health practitioners may be interested in checking those out. And then, of course, finally, I'll plug the Southeastern School Behavioral Health Community. Their annual conference is coming up in Myrtle Beach next month. And there are lots of presentations and topics that would be relevant, I think, for this crowd with CEUs available. All right. So thank you so much. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Right on time, so we've got 10 more minutes. If you have any questions and would like to ask them, you can just hover down at the bottom of your screen and there's an icon that says Q&A, and you can just type a question right here in the chat box. If you don't have a question, you're welcome to go ahead and sign out. In about 10-15 minutes, we'll email these slides as well as the resource packet we put together. But otherwise, I will hang around for the next 10 minutes or so if anyone has any questions. Okay, so Danny says, getting ready to go from secondary resource inclusion for learning disabilities to an ED self-contained class this fall. Been studying and gathering information and strategies. Wow, yeah, so self-contained, I did that my first year of teaching, and I think certainly related to the classroom management, I think that the resources that I provided today will give you a good background. I would recommend also, and I can send it to you, Danny, there's some good, a couple of good seminal research articles. One that came out within the past year that's titled The Current State of Emotional and Behavioral Disabilities. And I think that that would give you a lot of information and context if that's a new population for you. If that is not your, if you have not been certified in emotional disabilities, I would highly recommend, I mean, there are certainly classes at the University of South Carolina, and checking out the Council for Exceptional Children. I'm not sure what state you're from, but there are local conferences in South Carolina and all of the southeastern states that have lots of resources as well as opportunities for professional development. South Carolina. Okay, awesome. So I attended USC for emotional and behavioral disabilities, and I think they have an awesome program that would benefit anyone. They have, I'm pretty sure that they offer classes to non-degree seeking students if you were just interested in getting some extra knowledge. But, I think that once you get the classroom management down, it takes a while. Hopefully you'll have some sort of mentor or behavioral interventionist that can provide some support as you're, transitioning. But it's tough. I personally found the toughest part about it, providing such a variety of curriculum. So I don't know what grade you're going to be in, but I was in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So teaching 3 different Englishes or maths in a given day is super challenging. So I think just trying to figure that out and really having a community of practice would be great. Hi, Jenny. I will send that as well. So it's actually, I've got it here. So one of the authors is actually Lee Kern, who she directs the Center for Promoting Research to Practice that has all of these resources. And so it is in behavioral disorders. It actually came out this year, so 2019. And it's the title of the article is Supporting Students with Emotional or Behavioral Disorders, State of the Field. And it's by Barbara Mitchell, Lee Kern, and Maureen Conroy. And I think it does a really good job of just providing background information, gives a ton of statistics, as well as kind of where we've been, what we're still trying to work on, next steps. So behavioral, and I can send, I don't know if it's, I may not legally be able to share this article, but I can certainly send you the citation. Sure thing. Okay, let's see. I'm just going to clear these out of the queue, and we've still got a couple more minutes if anybody, oh, sure. And you know what, I think, here, I'm going to type the answer too, and I will send the citation. But, so it's supporting students with emotional or behavioral disorders, state of the field. And that was by Mitchell, Kern, and Conroy. And I think I sent the message. I don't know where it went to. Oh, yeah. I'm still getting used to Zoom. So you should be able to see the name of the article there, and I'll make sure that we send out a citation as well. Oh, look at you, Jenny. Thank you so much. So Jenny's copied the link to the journal article here in the Q&A box for those of you who are interested. Appreciate that, Jenny. Okay, well, I think people are starting to hop off, and I'm not seeing any more. Thank you, Danny. And I hope you all, thank you so much for hanging out with me at the end of the day. Actually, I see, it looks like there's some stuff in the chat here. That's from June. Okay, I won't respond to June. So I miss you guys too. But I think we can go ahead and close it out, Danielle. But thank you guys so much for hanging out, and we will get those materials to you very soon.